Why did they pull her over when she did nothing wrong? Hey, story lovers! Welcome back to Bella Stories, where I bring the most fascinating tales right to your screen. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on any of my stories. Megan's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the flashing red and blue lights glared in her rearview mirror. Her heart thudded wildly, and she pulled her car over to the side of the road, her fingers trembling. She knew she hadn't been speeding. She hadn't run a red light or broken any laws. So why were the cops stopping her? She watched through her mirror as two officers got out of the patrol car. Their faces were cold, their eyes narrowed. They moved slowly, one on each side of her car, as if she were dangerous. Megan's heart raced faster. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was Ethan, her husband. She quickly texted back, pulled over. Don't know why. She knew he'd worry. Ethan always worried about her, especially because of stories they'd heard about bad traffic stops. The officer on the driver's side tapped on her window. Megan rolled it down and looked up at him. He was tall, his face stern, his sunglasses hiding his eyes. License and registration, he barked. Sure, Megan replied, trying to keep her voice steady. She reached into her purse slowly, her hands visible. She had seen enough news reports to know how important that was. She handed over her license and reached for the glove box for her registration. What's in there? The officer snapped, his hand moving to his holster. Megan froze, her heart pounding. Just my registration, she whispered, her voice shaking. That's all. Slowly, he ordered, his tone harsh. Megan's hands trembled as she opened the glove box, pulled out the paper, and handed it to him. The officer snatched it from her, his eyes still cold. He glanced at it and then looked at her. Step out of the car. Megan's eyes widened. W.I. Step out of the car, ma'am. Now. Her stomach dropped. She glanced at the other officer, who stood by the passenger side, his hand resting on his weapon. What was going on? She hadn't done anything wrong. Why were they treating her like this? She unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out slowly. The officer moved back, watching her closely. Hands on the hood, he ordered. Megan's eyes filled with tears, but she did as she was told. Her heart was pounding so loud she could hear it. People were driving by, staring. She felt humiliated. What did they think she had done? The officer patted her down roughly, his hands cold and uncaring. She flinched, but didn't dare move. What did I do? She asked, her voice cracking. Quiet, the officer snapped. We ask the questions. Megan's phone buzzed again inside the car. Ethan. She prayed he would come soon. She had sent him her location before getting out of the car. He would know where she was. He would come and help her. The second officer began searching her car, throwing things around carelessly. Megan watched as her bag was dumped out, her purse emptied. Tears streamed down her face. Please, why are you doing this? The officer didn't answer. He just kept searching, digging through her things like she was a criminal. But she wasn't. She was just a wife driving home from work. She hadn't done anything wrong. The first officer finally stepped back. Why are you crying? Got something to hide? He taunted. No. I just don't understand, Megan whispered. I didn't do anything wrong. The officer scoffed. That's what they all say. He turned to his partner. Find anything? Nothing, the other officer replied, sounding disappointed. Megan let out a shaky breath, hoping this nightmare would end. But then the officer grabbed her arm roughly, twisting it behind her back. You're coming with us, he said, coldly. Megan's heart stopped. What? Why? Suspicious behavior, he replied, pulling out handcuffs. No! Megan cried, struggling. I didn't do anything. The officer tightened his grip. Stop resisting, he shouted. Or it's going to get worse. Megan felt the cold metal of the handcuffs snap around her wrists. She was being arrested. For what? She couldn't breathe. Her head was spinning. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. Suddenly, a car screeched to a stop behind the police cruiser. The door flew open, and a familiar voice shouted, "What do you think you're doing?" Megan's heart leaped. It was Ethan. He ran toward them, his face furious, his badge shining on his belt. The officers froze, their faces going pale. They looked at Ethan, then at the badge, then back at Ethan. You messed with the wrong person, Ethan growled, his eyes blazing. The officers stood there, stunned, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Megan's eyes were wide, her heart racing. What was Ethan going to do? Would he be able to help her? Everything was happening so fast. She was in handcuffs, the officers were speechless, and Ethan looked like he was about to explode. What was going to happen next? Would Ethan be able to save her, or would things get worse? Ethan's eyes were blazing with anger as he marched toward the officers. He moved with a fierce determination, his badge glinting in the sunlight. Megan had never seen him look so furious before. Her heart raced, hope flooding through her. But she was still in handcuffs, her wrists aching. Would he really be able to help her? The officer holding her arm seemed to snap out of his shock. He straightened, his jaw tightening. Step back, sir, he barked. This is police business. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Police business, he echoed, his voice low and dangerous. I'm a detective, and that's my wife. Both officers stiffened. They looked at each other, panic flashing across their faces. The second officer took a step back, his mouth falling open. Detective? Ethan pulled out his badge, holding it up. Detective Ethan Carter. Internal Affairs. His voice was cold as ice. Want to explain why my wife is in handcuffs? Megan watched as the officers' faces went pale. Internal Affairs. That meant Ethan was one of the people who investigated bad cops. The ones who broke the rules. No wonder they looked scared. The first officer swallowed hard. He quickly let go of Megan's arm and stepped back. We were just doing our job, sir. Your job? Ethan's voice was deadly calm. Your job is to protect people. Not harass innocent women. Especially not my wife. His eyes were locked on the officer's face. Take those cuffs off. Now. The officer fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. Megan's wrists were freed, and she rubbed them, relief washing over her. But the fear was still there, her heart still pounding. What if Ethan hadn't come? What would they have done to her? Ethan stood between her and the officers, his body tense. What was the reason for this stop? The officer stammered, his eyes darting around. She looked suspicious. Ethan's eyes narrowed even more. Suspicious? How? Was she speeding? Did she break any laws? The officer hesitated, his face turning red. No. But she looked nervous. Ethan's jaw tightened. Nervous? You mean like how anyone would look when two officers surround their car and order them out for no reason? The officer didn't answer. His partner looked at the ground, his shoulders slumped. Megan felt a wave of anger rise inside her. They had humiliated her, frightened her, all because they thought she looked nervous? Tears stung her eyes again, but this time they were tears of anger, not fear. Ethan's voice was sharp. You searched her car. Did you find anything illegal? The officer shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. No, sir. Ethan crossed his arms. So you pulled her over, scared her half to death, searched her car, and put her in handcuffs, all because she looked nervous? His voice was dripping with disbelief. Do you have any idea how wrong that is? The officer looked at his feet, shame coloring his cheeks. His partner didn't even look up. They knew they were in trouble. Ethan took a step closer, his voice low. I could end your careers for this. The threat hung in the air, heavy and cold. I could have you both fired. You know that, right? Megan watched as the officers' faces went white. They looked terrified. Good, she thought. They deserve to be scared after what they did to her. The first officer opened his mouth, his voice shaky. We were just trying to do our job. Ethan's eyes flashed. No. You were abusing your power. And you messed with the wrong person. He looked at Megan, his eyes softening. Are you okay? Megan nodded, wiping her tears. I think so. Her voice was shaky, but she was starting to feel safe again. With Ethan there, she knew nothing bad would happen to her. Ethan turned back to the officers. Apologize. Now. Both officers looked up, their faces pale. We're sorry, ma'am, the first officer stammered. We made a mistake. Megan looked at them, her anger still boiling. A mistake, she repeated. You scared me. You treated me like a criminal. For no reason. Her voice cracked, the fear and humiliation rushing back. Do you know how that feels? The officers looked down, shame washing over them. They didn't answer. They couldn't. Ethan's voice was firm. Get in your car and leave. I'll be reporting this. And trust me, Internal Affairs doesn't go easy on bullies with badges. The officers moved quickly, not daring to argue. They rushed back to their patrol car, their faces pale and fearful. They didn't look back as they drove away, the flashing lights fading into the distance. Megan let out a shaky breath, her body trembling. It was over. But the fear was still there, gripping her chest. She looked at Ethan, her eyes wide. What if you hadn't come? Ethan's face softened, and he pulled her into a hug. I'll always come for you, he whispered. Always. Megan closed her eyes, leaning into him. She felt safe now, wrapped in his arms. But a chill ran down her spine as she remembered the officer's cold voice, the tight grip on her arm. What if Ethan hadn't been there? What would they have done to her? Ethan pulled back, his eyes serious. Let's get you home. Megan nodded, her body still shaking. She got back into her car, her hands trembling as she gripped the wheel. Ethan climbed into his own car, following closely behind. But as they drove away, Megan's phone buzzed again. She glanced down, her heart skipping a beat. It was an unknown number. She picked it up, her voice shaky. Hello? There was silence on the other end. Then a low voice whispered, You made a big mistake. Megan's blood ran cold. Her hands went numb, and the phone slipped from her fingers, landing on the floor. Who was that? And what did they mean? Who was behind the call, and how much danger were they in? Megan's heart raced as she drove home, Ethan's car right behind hers. She couldn't stop thinking about the call. Who would say something like that? Was it one of the officers? Or someone else watching them? Her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. When they finally reached home, Ethan rushed over to her, his face full of concern. Are you okay? You were driving so fast. What happened? Megan's voice shook as she spoke. I got a call. Someone said I made a big mistake. Her eyes were wide with fear. What does that mean? Who was it? Ethan's face darkened. He took her hand, leading her inside. Let's get you safe first. He locked the door behind them, double-checking the windows. Did you recognize the voice? Megan shook her head, her body trembling. No. But it was cold. Like they were threatening me. She looked at Ethan, fear shining in her eyes. What if it was one of those officers? What if they're angry because of what you said? Ethan's jaw tightened. If they're trying to intimidate you, they picked the wrong person to mess with. He took out his phone, his fingers moving quickly. I'm calling this in. We're getting to the bottom of this. Megan watched as he spoke to someone on the phone, his voice low and serious. He gave details about the stop, the officers, and the call she received. His face was set, his eyes burning with determination. After he hung up, he pulled Megan into a hug. I've reported it. If those officers are behind this, they'll be dealt with. And if it's someone else, we'll find out who. Megan leaned into him, her body shaking. But a chill ran down her spine. What if this wasn't over? What if they came after her again? That night, she couldn't sleep. Every little noise made her jump, her heart racing. She kept replaying the call in her head, hearing that cold voice over and over again. You made a big mistake. What did it mean? What mistake? Suddenly, there was a loud bang outside. Megan shot up in bed, her heart pounding. Ethan, she whispered, shaking him awake. Did you hear that? Ethan's eyes snapped open, his body tense. He jumped out of bed, grabbing his gun from the nightstand. Stay here, he whispered. Lock the door. Megan's heart raced as he crept out of the room, his footsteps quiet. She ran to the door, locking it and pressing her ear against it, trying to hear what was happening. There was another bang, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Megan's blood ran cold. Someone was breaking in. She backed away from the door, her body trembling. Should she call the police? But what if it was those officers? What if they were here to hurt her? Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm. 911, what's your emergency? Megan's voice was barely above a whisper. Someone's breaking into my house. Please, hurry. The operator asked for her address, and Megan gave it, her eyes fixed on the door. Her heart raced, her body frozen in fear. Where was Ethan? Was he okay? Suddenly, there was a loud crash, followed by a shout. Megan recognized Ethan's voice. Stop! Police! Then there was a struggle, the sound of punches and grunts. Megan's heart was in her throat. She wanted to run out and help, but she was too scared. She backed up against the wall, sliding down to the floor, her body shaking. She heard more crashing, then silence. The silence was terrifying. It was too quiet. Was Ethan okay? Did they hurt him? Her mind raced with fear. She wanted to scream, but her throat was tight, no sound coming out. Then the door burst open, and Megan screamed, covering her face. But it was Ethan. He was breathing hard, his face bruised, but he was okay. Relief flooded through her as she ran to him, throwing her arms around him. I thought they hurt you. Ethan held her tight, his body trembling. They tried, he whispered. But they won't be hurting anyone again. Megan looked up at him, confusion in her eyes. Who were they? Ethan's face was grim. It was those two officers. They tried to break in. They were going to hurt you to get back at me. His eyes were cold with anger. But they're in cuffs now. Backup's on the way. Megan's knees went weak. She almost collapsed, but Ethan held her up. They did this? Just because you stood up to them? Her voice was shaky, her mind racing. I thought police were supposed to protect people. Ethan's face softened. Most of us do. But some let the power go to their heads. He hugged her tight. I'm so sorry you went through this. Megan held onto him, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe this was happening. The people who were supposed to keep her safe were the ones trying to hurt her. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. Megan jumped, fear shooting through her. But Ethan squeezed her hand. It's okay. It's backup. He opened the door, and several officers rushed in, their faces serious. They spoke with Ethan, taking his statement, and then led the two crooked officers away in handcuffs. Megan watched from the window, her body still trembling. One of the officers looked back at her, his eyes full of hatred. His mouth moved, and she could barely make out his words, "This isn't over." Megan's heart stopped. Her body went cold. What did he mean? Would they come after her again? Would she ever feel safe? She turned to Ethan, her voice shaking. Will they come back? Ethan's jaw tightened. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her protectively. Not if I have anything to say about it. His voice was fierce, full of determination. I'll protect you, no matter what. But as she rested her head against his chest, Megan couldn't shake the fear that this wasn't truly over. Those officers were full of anger, and they had power. Even behind bars, they could still find ways to hurt her. Would she ever be free of this nightmare? Or would she always be looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next attack? As the sirens faded into the night, Megan held on to Ethan, hoping he could keep his promise. But deep down, she knew this was far from over. And that's it for today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to smash that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe if you haven't already. There are so many more amazing stories coming your way, and we can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, keep dreaming, keep exploring, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.